The Soviet Union, an empire that once covered vast parts of Eurasia, has long captivated our imagination, yet most of our understanding is confined to Cold War rhetoric and iconic symbols such as Sputnik, nuclear weapons, and the Berlin Wall. While fascinating, this perspective only just scratches the surface and neglects the quirky and, frankly, pretty weird aspects that characterize daily life in this complex nation that was, well, though so different from our own. So today, let's put aside the political chest beating and grandiose military icons and instead zoom in on those little weird details. Here's 5 of them. Car ownership is something that we all take for granted in the Western world. For us, it is all but given that basically anyone can afford a car one way or another. Sure, it might not be a Rolls-Royce or a Lamborghini, but still, the possibility of a car is open to basically all of us. This was not the case in the Soviet Union, where car ownership was a privilege enjoyed by only a select few. Worse still, for the lucky few who did manage to get their hands on a car, the process of actually acquiring it was a bureaucratic hellscape that required the jumping of many hurdles and often the crossing of several palms with ribbons. To explain this further, let us begin with that most basic of obstacles to car ownership, the cost of buying a car. For the average Soviet citizen in the 1980s, their yearly salary was roughly 2,000 rubles a year, including all bonuses and incentives. This, frankly, was nowhere near enough to even begin to cover the cost of buying a car. Take, for instance, the most prestigious car a Soviet citizen could acquire, the mighty GAZ-24 Volga. The cost of this bucket of magnificence was a staggering 16,480 rubles. In 1984, just over 8 times the average salary. So clearly, the average Soviet citizen wasn't affording a Volga. But surely, you cry, surely this was communism. The state must have provided a cheap and cheerful car for the masses, right? Well, yeah, they kind of did in a way. There was this, the venerable VAZ-2101. This reliable and utilitarian workhorse could be yours for the low price of 6,000 rubles in 1984, a mere 3 times the average yearly salary. It's a bargain. It's a steal. How can you argue with that value? Now, to really put this amazing value into perspective, the equivalent cost of the Volga and VAZ in the United States would have been around $280,000 and $105,000 respectively in 1984. For comparison, a Lamborghini Countach and a Ferrari Testarossa cost $100,000 and $94,000 respectively in that same year. But let's say someone actually managed to save up the megabucks needed to buy a car in the Soviet Union. After all, people did own these cars, so evidently it was viable on some level. What was the process of actually getting your hands on one of these bad boys? Well, there were no car dealers in the Soviet Union, so rather than the time-honored Western tradition of verbally jousting with a silver-tongued con man eager to empty your wallet, you instead had to go to your employer and, while putting on your best Oliver Twist impression, ask, "Please, sir, can I have some car?" You see, in the Soviet Union, the allocation of cars was controlled by the trade unions, with each union being given a quota of cars to distribute to companies under their purview. Then it was the responsibility of each of the companies to decide which of its workers deserved to be allocated to buy cars that they had been assigned. And you might be thinking, surely that's where the bureaucracy ends, but no, this is the Soviet Union. That is merely where it begins, comrade, because if you were lucky enough to be selected to buy a car, your application then had to go back to the government, who would then run a background check to make sure that you hadn't had any naughty opinions that would make you unworthy of owning a car. This background check alone could take over a year. Then, after waiting just to find out if you were allowed to buy a car, you then had to go on a waiting list. For you see, if a company had more wannabe motorists than cars, which they always did all the time, names were added to a list, with the company's incoming allocation of cars being distributed to the people at the top of the list, and given the low number of cars produced in the Soviet Union, it could easily take up to 10 years for your name to reach the top of the list. It wasn't all bad, however. At least car insurance was cheap, and better still, if you didn't hit anyone all year, you got your premium refunded. So, well, that's a nice bonus, isn't it? Air travel, to most of us in the Western world, is mundane to the point of being a chore, an enjoyable but necessary exercise we all endure to jet off to exotic locales around the world. But really, when you think about it, we actually have it pretty good. Basically, everyone can afford to do it. The government doesn't restrict how and why we can travel, and we have a smorgasbord of airlines to choose from, each competing to offer us the most convenient schedules, the best prices, and the finest in-flight services. This was not the case in the Soviet Union. So let's start with the choice, or rather lack of choice, of airlines available to the Soviet jet setter. But while Aeroflot, state-owned of course, may have been the only game in town, they were a behemoth of a company with a fleet of over 10,000 aircraft and over 600,000 people on their payroll. This, however, shouldn't be taken to assume that the Soviet Union had surprisingly advanced infrastructure. It didn't. Airports and planes simply proved cheaper to build than modern rail and road infrastructure. Then there was the cost, which was simply astronomical. Consider this: a one-way ticket from Moscow to Khabarovsk, a city in the country's far east, would cost about 180 rubles in the 1980s. That's just over the nation's whole average monthly salary. More staggering was the cost of a flight from Moscow to Vladivostok, which would set one back an exorbitant 240 rubles. Contrast this with the present day, where a Muscovite earning an average monthly salary of 51,000 rubles can secure a one-way ticket to Vladivostok for approximately a tenth of their monthly salary, and the inaccessibility of air travel in the Soviet era truly becomes apparent. But the weirdness doesn't stop there, as for some reason, Aeroflot, the only airline in the whole country, still advertised. The adverts were suitably weird. Some, such as the typical glamour shots of picture-perfect air stewardesses who looked mysteriously just like the picture-perfect girls in all the other adverts, were understandable enough. But where it got really weird was when it got, well, for want of a better description, when it got Soviet, such as this 1962 poster, which advertises Aeroflot with all the patriotic zeal you'd expect from a 1930s propaganda poster, encouraging you to charge into Nazi machine gun fire for the motherland. As for why a company with a state-provided monopoly put so much effort into its advertising, well, your guess is as good as ours, actually. And then there was the food on board. Considering this presents us with two possibilities. Either Aeroflot was exclusively used by bodybuilders, or the service was just a bit crap, because you had one option: the ever-tasty, the ever-nutritious, and not at all bland chicken and rice. The dish became so predictable, in fact, that it became a running joke amongst frequent flyers. Not the funny kind of joke, mind you, the laugh the pain away kind of joke. There was one exception to this monotonous culinary litany, however: international flights. Because you see, on international flights, there might be foreigners, and the foreigners might go back home and tell their foreigner friends about the chicken and rice, thus besmirching the glorious name of the Soviet Union and all of its efforts in illustrious socialist construction. Photography was also explicitly banned on flights. This seemed to be rooted primarily in jingoistic ego, with the Soviet Union for some reason being absolutely terrified that the West would discover what the cabins of its airliners looked like. Again, your guess is as good as ours. The Soviet education system is often touted as one of the regime's major successes, and frankly, it's hard to disagree with this. It was renowned for its high standards of teaching, particularly in the STEM subjects. It was free at all levels, regardless of social status, and typically did a fantastic job sending talented young people off into suitable fields that would allow them to thrive in their future careers. But despite this overall quality, like everything else in the Soviet Union, it also had its fair share of eyebrow-raising weirdness, primarily its highly militarized nature. Under this system, children were free to enjoy their innocence until their teenage years, at which point initial military training was introduced into their curriculum. This had two aims. First, it was to prepare young men for their compulsory military service, ensuring that they were familiar with the rudiments of military life and basic operations before their formal introduction. And secondly, it was to force a sense of camaraderie and collectivist thinking within all members of the class, collectivism naturally being a bit of a big deal in the communist Soviet Union. As part of this program, twice a week, the students would swap their usual classrooms for makeshift military grounds, donning khaki uniforms and being led through their paces by retired military officers. These individuals, often battle-hardened veterans, saw their jobs as either a great honor, raising the next generation of new Soviet men, or an easy way of topping up their military pension. It depends who you ask. The training was immersive and comprehensive. Beyond mere marching drills, the students were taught tactical maneuvering, how to respond to chemical and nuclear attacks, and even basic medical procedures like wound dressing and CPR. The realities of handling a weapon, from maintenance to accurate firing, were also a part of this intense immersion. Anecdotal evidence suggests that for many students, the sheer sheer thrill of holding an actual firearm, albeit in a controlled environment, was an experience unlike any other. The training was also not just confined to school boundaries, as sometimes for a special treat, students would get to go to local military bases where they would test their skills and get to do some really cool stuff that was not safe to do on school grounds. One such example was hand grenade throwing, an activity that for many was the highlight of the course. But as fun as all of this was, as the students progressed towards the end of their 10th grade, the reality of their training began to dawn on them, as in an act signifying the transition from the controlled environment of school to the real world, the military instructors would ask each male student about their preferred direction when they were drafted into the military. This was nothing if not a reality check, reminding students that while ditching normal lessons to play with Kalashnikovs was certainly fun, there was ultimately a very serious and quite morbid methodology behind it all. Yet, despite this distinctly macabre undernote, years later, many of the students look back on this time with a strange sense of nostalgia. They recall the excitement, the novelty, and the sense of belonging that this unique part of their education brought them. For them, it was the embodiment of the larger societal values present in the Soviet Union and an ingenious mechanism to instill discipline, resilience, and unity amongst its young citizens, and in the process it left an indelible mark on those who underwent it, creating generations of individuals who were as adept at navigating the challenges of life as they were at the battlefield. In the Soviet Union, even the common ritual of grocery shopping, a typically mundane chore, was just a bit weird. For starters, the range of foodstuffs was limited, and the few available were always in short supply, making the term deficit a customary part of the Soviet lexicon, except in Moscow, which, as the capital and the most important city in the country, was always prioritized for grocery goods, becoming something of a commercial promised land, a utopia where all goods were available at all times, for the most part. This relative abundance triggered regular mass influxes of shoppers from surrounding towns and cities, and occasionally even other republics, on shopping expeditions colloquially referred to as sausage trains. This phenomenon extended to other cities too. Moscow might have been the pièce de résistance of the Soviet Union, and therefore received the highest priority for supplying with grocery goods, but many other cities, such as republic capitals like Kiev and Yerevan, and nuclear cities such as Pripyat, were also given high priority for supplying with food, and so they received their own sausage trains from the surrounding areas. But while the distribution of food in the Soviet Union might have been unusual, so too was its retailing. Far removed from the one-stop supermarkets of the West, the Soviet Union was characterized by highly specialized stores: bread stores, milk stores, fish stores, meat stores, and the like, each dedicated to a single type of product. But even these highly focused outlets had their idiosyncrasies. For example, bread, when available, was highly subsidized by the state and therefore extremely cheap, which led to farmers buying it in excessive quantities to feed their livestock as it was cheaper than animal fodder, the difference, of course, going straight to their pockets. Similarly, milk products weren't typically pre-packaged, instead being cut or portioned out on the spot. This led to customers turning up with all manner of bizarre household containers to fill up with milk. But perhaps the oddest and certainly most famous aspect of grocery shopping was the endless queuing. This was a consequence of the sporadic supply of goods, as if you didn't know when the next supply was coming in, you made damn sure to get in line and get some whenever the opportunity presented itself. This shopping trend led to the wide proliferation of an essentially Soviet shopping accessory, the avozka. This was a simple string bag that you kept about your person at all times, ensuring that should you be passing a store and it gets a sudden delivery of new stock, you were in a position to pounce on it and be at the front of the queue, lest you return home, grab your bag, only to return minutes later and find that the store is sold out. It wasn't all haggling and queues, however. If you had connections, you were a king amongst men. All it took was a friend or a family member to be working at a store, and you could skip the serpentine lines and just buy or be given your goods through the back door on demand. So prolific was this that often a store's staff would put large amounts of their shipments aside for this explicit purpose, it not being rare at all for an entire store's staff to be in cahoots. Theft was also prolific from stores, but not by customers, as you might imagine, but by the staff. Oftentimes, items weren't even stolen for personal consumption, but for bartering, with it being simpler to trade goods stolen from work rather than trying to procure things from official channels. Maybe you've got a chicken coop that needs painting. Well, just go see your uncle Yuri, who works at the Anatol factory, with a nice leg of 5-finger discounted lamb in hand, and he'll slip you some aircraft paint in return. Indeed, in the Soviet Union was often a job's ability to open up alternative means of generating income and procuring goods that determined its desirability, and well, that segues rather nicely into our final chapter today. If we were to ask you to think of the most prestigious job one could aspire to in the Soviet Union, what would come to mind? Perhaps a cosmonaut, dangerously pushing the bounds of science while having the media treat you like a rock star. Or maybe an atomic scientist using your elbow grease to single-handedly protect your nation's superpower status. Whatever you thought of, though, we're willing to bet that it wasn't taxi driver. Now, this may sound crazy, but in the Soviet era, driving a taxi was one of the most lucrative and therefore one of the most prestigious jobs that one could hope to land. At face value, this proposition sounds absurd, as they only had a salary of around 150 to 200 rubles per month in the 1980s, pretty much dead on average for the time. But you see, the great winnings afforded by this profession didn't come from the salary, but rather all the other things that they could do off the books when they got their hands on a taxi. One common trick involved exploiting a loophole in the way that Soviet taxi companies were run. The way it worked was that taxi drivers were given a quota of miles that they had to cover and customers that they had to pick up on a given day. When these quotas, which were often set by taxi rank managers who were very much on the fiddle as their drivers were met, then the meter was turned off and all subsequent takings went straight into the driver's pocket. Some drivers, those whose rank managers were sticklers for the rules, achieved the same effect by manipulating their taxi meters with makeshift tools, reducing the kilometers driven to conveniently just around the minimum quota each day. The managers were no fools, of course, and they knew full well that every single taxi under them conveniently coming in at almost exactly the minimum mileage every day was a clear sign the driver was on the fiddle, but they could never prove anything concretely, and so it continued. Many drivers also made sure to hang around airports, train stations, and hotels. The advantage here was twofold. Firstly, it provided a steady stream of long-distance fares that quickly ate up that minimum mileage, and secondly, it provided them with plenty of clueless foreigners who would be unaware of local taxi rates and thus prime for fleecing. Some savvy drivers also profited from Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign. As part of this campaign, the hours during which alcohol could be purchased were restricted, with most stores being forbidden to sell alcohol late at night. So, well, what did the taxi drivers do? They purchased vodka during the day and resold it at premium prices at night, exploiting a ready market of desperate consumers. Everyone knew this too, so the taxi drivers didn't even have to patrol for customers. The customers came to them. There's also another seedier extra activity that some Soviet taxi drivers partook in under the cover of darkness. They worked as pimps, developing illicit partnerships with sex workers and leveraging their taxis as pimpmobiles. The setup was simple yet effective. The drivers would ferry the sex workers to and from their clients, providing a degree of safety and mobility that was otherwise hard to come by. In exchange, the drivers took a sizable cut from their earnings. This shadowy, nocturnal ecosystem thrived in the underbelly of the Soviet cities, facilitated by the ubiquitous yellow cabs that could discreetly blend into the urban landscape. It was a risky and morally dubious enterprise, but for these drivers, the allure of quick, substantial cash outweighed the legal and ethical considerations. These strategies may have been morally dubious, but they worked. And as a result, taxi drivers were easily among the wealthiest citizens in the Soviet Union, a far cry from their Western counterparts.